Have you heard what's been happening in the Spanish Soccer Federation the last week? At the celebration, the achievement of a World Cup victory for the Spanish women's soccer team, the head of the Spanish Soccer Federation took one of the winners, one of the stars of the team, and forcibly kissed her on the lips. And he has refused to apologize, or he's apologized half-heartedly. And just this week, at a meeting of the governing body of the Spanish Soccer Federation, he said, I am not resigning, I am not resigning. The entire squad has resolved to not play for the country again if he doesn't go. Now, this reaction to what he did is a reflection of the modern world. It's this Me Too awareness that we have in the last several years, that there are certain things you just don't do to other people, particularly sexual things, or personal space things, or personal autonomy violations. Now, the question is, are the issues that have been raised by the Spanish Soccer Federation violation or by the Me Too movement, are they new issues or have they always been issues? Well, the truth is they've always been issues. 20 years ago, I led a book discussion on a book called The Red Tent. Some of you may have read it, by Anita Diamant. It is a feminist retelling of the patriarchal stories, but focused more on the women's perspectives, with women's voices. And when I led the discussion, I said, well, it seems to me this is very much a modern consciousness projected back into that time period. And one of the participants rightfully challenged me and said, do you think women didn't care about these things back then? Of course they cared about rape and fertility issues and abortion and domestic violence and all kinds of issues that are brought out in the narrative. And I realized that what I really meant to be saying was that the reaction to those issues in ancient times might have been different. Maybe that's just the way it is, they thought. Maybe that's the way it's designed to be. Maybe that's the way our God or our tradition has commanded it, that these things may be done to people who are less than full people, like women. We have a different response today. And so that's good. We do not accept these things as inevitable. We reject them as unjust. One of the key questions we'll explore through today's Torah portion is this question of judging the past by the values of the present. Are we allowed to do that? And I would say yes. That's what progress means. If you don't judge the past or judge your present, then you can't improve. And that is a true kind of moral relativism, where you say, well, I can't decide from the past. They had their ideas. Of course they had their ideas. And we're allowed to have ours, and we're allowed to disagree. And it's not insulting your ancestors to disagree with them. It's taking them seriously. It's treating them like adults. It's treating them like full people. Because a full person you can argue with. A god or a child, maybe you impose or obey without thinking. We want to relate in a mature relationship with our past. We have to be willing to challenge it. One of the key questions in this Torah portion, as we'll see, is the question of who is a full person. Is a woman a full person? Is a child a full person? Is a slave a full person? In the traditional morning blessing, men every morning would say, thank you, God, for not making me a woman and for not making me a slave. As the early Jewish feminist scholar Rachel Bialy pointed out in her book, Women in Jewish Law, only one of these categories of women, children, and slaves is not permanent, at least is not fixable by itself. You see, children, at least boys, grow out of childhood. They become full people. But slaves, without the master's acquiescence, women in no way could become a full person under Jewish law and Jewish tradition. This fall, in October, next year, that is next Jewish year, which is just a couple of months away, we'll be exploring this question of Me Too in the Hebrew Bible in a little more depth. But some of the texts we'll look at then will be part of this Torah portion. And the other theme I want to highlight as we go into this Torah discussion is the purpose of law. Is it to enforce a social order for what's good for people, or is it to enforce spiritual purity? Is it a question of taboos? And if people have written these stories, as we believe, then they've decided to claim a God said to do this. And we'll have to ask, is a purity law approach a better way to enforce morality? Or would consequences and results be more effective? As secular Jews, we tend to focus on consequences and results, but maybe there's something to be said for magic and taboo. Now, the Torah portion we're looking at is called Tetzei, which means when you go out to the field of battle. And it appears between basically Deuteronomy 21 and Deuteronomy 25. It starts in the middle of each chapter, but the Torah portions don't follow the chapters. Those were a later innovation. And we should recall that most of the book of Deuteronomy is laws, not narratives and stories like Genesis, it's laws. And the name that we use for this book in Hebrew is Devarim, which just means words, things. It's not very helpful. The word in Latin for it is Deuteronomium, which is Deutero, the second, and nomos is law. It's a retelling of the law. So Deuteronomy, being full of laws, makes sense with the general English name or the Latin name for the book. So we begin in Deuteronomy 21. And as we go through these passages, I want you to think, and maybe we'll discuss a little bit, what are some parallels to this that we might have today, if we do? And if there is a parallel, which is better? This traditional version or our modern version? So verse 10. When you, as an Israelite warrior, take the field against your enemies, and your God Yahweh delivers them into your power, and you take captives, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire her, and you would take her into your household as a wife. I'll point out the word for wife in Hebrew is isha, which just means you'll take her into your house as a woman. Because the words in Hebrew, in Old Hebrew, for man and wife were actually Baal, master, and Isha was just woman. You can think Bess, you as my woman, Porgy and Bess, but it's also simply the role of the woman is in this role. So you see among the captives a beautiful woman, you desire her, you would take her as your wife, you bring her into your household, she trims her hair, she cuts her nails, and she discards her captive garb. She shall spend a month's time in your household, lamenting her father and mother, and after that you may come to her and thus become her husband, her Baal, her master, and she will be your Isha, your woman, your wife. And then, should you no longer want her, you must release her outright. You shall not sell her for money. Since you had your will of her, you must not enslave her. Now, do we have any parallel to war brides in contemporary society? Like, what would be a parallel? Well, in history, for sure. But do we have anything in our society today that would parallel this? Well, there is women trafficking. I mean, we know that this happens, sex trafficking and sexual abuse like that. That still exists. There are still people who, do the mail order bride. It's a punchline for a joke, but it does happen, and it's a terrible situation. I think we treat people and treat women more like people than to allow them to do this. And how long is she supposed to spend mourning her father and her mother? 1 month. Now, is that compassion for her? Possibly. What else would that allow you to know?
Make sure she's not pregnant.
That's right. If she has a period, in that 1 month, you'll know that she's not pregnant. So it's compassion, yes, but there's also a very patriarchal and, problematic motivation behind it too. And then it says, if you don't want her, she's not just a slave that you've taken, she's a captive bride, and so you need to release her. You can't simply sell her as you could other slaves to someone else. Is that progress? Maybe a little tiny bit. I wouldn't put it on the top 10 list of the best Jewish ethics ever. But it's a little progress. The next teaching. If a householder has 2 wives, one loved and the other unloved, and both the unloved and the loved one have borne him sons, But the firstborn is the son of the unloved one. So here we have a loved wife and an unloved wife, but the unloved wife gave the firstborn son, even though there are sons on both sides. When the man wills his property to his sons, he may not treat as firstborn the son of the loved wife in disregard of the son of the unloved one who is older. Instead, he must accept the firstborn, the son of the unloved one, and allot him a double portion of all he possesses. Since he is the first fruit of his vigor, the birthright is his due. Imagine a family with 3 kids, a boy, a girl, and a boy. When you're dividing up the family property on the death of the householder, you actually divide it into 3 pieces. The oldest boy gets 2, the youngest boy gets 1, the daughter gets bupkis, nothing. That's the traditional division. Now, if there are only girls, then it gets divided among them. But if there's 1 boy and 5 girls, the boy gets everything. And if there's an older son and a younger son, the older one has to get a double portion because he was the firstborn. This is the birthright. We see this battle throughout the Hebrew Bible, the firstborn versus the secondborn. In wrestling, you've got Isaac, who's the secondborn after Ishmael. You have Jacob, who's the secondborn after Esau. You have Solomon, who is the multiple born after other sons of David. There's rivalries between children. Now, we have, I think, a much more egalitarian approach to children today. We don't prize our firstborn more than our secondborn or our thirdborn. At least we shouldn't. We don't give them a double portion automatically. We don't require it. Is that better? I would think so. Think of all the rivalries within families that exist anyways. It's not as if my kids love each other all the time. They have plenty of rivalries as it is. But if they knew that the system was gamed against them, and the older would get more than the younger, or my daughter being older would get nothing and my son would get everything, that would not be a helpful dynamic. So one more example of the family dynamics are there. They had to resolve it in some way. We might choose a different resolution. This is one of my favorite teachings here, especially what the rabbis do with it and their interpretations. And I use it, by the way, in my 7th grade class. It gets the kids' attention too. If a householder has a wayward and defiant son who does not heed his father or his mother and does not obey them even after they discipline him, his father and mother must take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the town at the public place of his community. And they shall say to the elders of the town, "This our son is disloyal and defiant. He does not listen to us. He is a glutton and a drunkard." Thereupon his town's council shall stone him to death. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. All Israel will hear and be afraid. If you have a stubborn and rebellious child, you stone them to death. Now, if you've ever had children, or you've ever been a child, you know that at some point, children are stubborn and rebellious. A strict enforcement of this law would mean the end of humanity. So what do the rabbis do with this? Well, they can't just cross it out. They can't just ignore it, so they have to interpret. They say, well, it says in the Hebrew, a ben soreru more, a stubborn and rebellious son. So that means sons but not daughters. Just say 50%. It says a son, so that means a child. But of course, a minor is not subject to the death penalty. And once he's an adult, he's no longer a son in the same way. So it's in a limited window of time. Maybe, from scheduling the bar mitzvah to after this party. I mean, there's a very limited window when you're subject to this full punishment. And then it says his father and his mother take hold of him. That means they both have to agree. They say he's a glutton and a drunkard. How much does he have to drink? How much does he have to eat to qualify as the stubborn and rebellious child? And on and on and on. They qualify it till at the end of the discussion, one of the rabbis says, there never was a stubborn and rebellious child and there never will be. Why is it here then? Well, it's to teach and learn. And then one rabbi says, there was one once and I saw his grave and I sat on it. Now, How do we respond to stubborn and rebellious children? We don't stone them. What's the new model of discipline? Even past, beyond spanking? It's called time out. Right? You have them sit down and sit quietly and think about what they've done. And they hate it. They yell and they scream and they are not happy. But it's not physical contact. I mean, think about the discipline when your kid is bullying another kid and then you smack them and say, don't hit someone smaller than you. But you just did that. So here again is a case accepting not only corporal punishment for children, but capital punishment for children. Why? What's the violation here? Honor your mother and your father. It's a taboo. You have violated the authority structure. And so it must be squished, crushed, eliminated. Notice the line at the end. Thus you will sweep evil out of your midst. You see, the child being rebellious is evil. Not just a bad idea, not just bad for society or for shalom bait, peace and it's evil and needs to be eliminated. It upends the order. This is the phraseology I was mentioning, this question of a taboo, a violation of the divinely planned order. In chapter 22, we change to another question of order. If you see your fellow Israelite's ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your peer. If your fellow Israelite does not live near you, or you do not know who the owner is, you shall bring it home. It shall remain with you until your peer claims it, and then you shall give it back. You will do the same with that person's donkey. You will do the same with that person's garment. And so you will do with anything that your fellow Israelite loses and you find. You do not remain indifferent. Literally, do not be mute. Don't just let it go. In fact, if you see your fellow Israelite's donkey or ox fallen on the road, do not ignore it. Lift that up together. Now, what is this parallel in modern society? Dealing with lost goods, right? Returning lost property. The idea of the Good Samaritan, different Bible, but same idea. It's almost like a lost and found, right? The idea of having a lost and found where you just collect things and people can claim them later, but having a whole community that works like a lost and found. This is actually wonderful. The idea of a responsibility for lost goods. Now, when the rabbis interpret this, sometimes it's useful and sometimes it goes to the comedic. In this particular case, there was a debate once in the rabbinical court. When is a chicken lost? How far away from the home of the owner does it have to go before it counts as lost? And the decision was that about 50 cubits, or a cubit's about 1.5 feet, 50 of those, and then it counts as lost. If it's closer than 50, it's in the property. If it's more than 50, it's lost. So then one rabbi asked, what if it has 1 foot on one side of the 50 cubit line and 1 foot on the other side of the 50? They threw him out of the house and studied. They said, stop asking too many questions. That's too much detail. But I love the institution of returning lost goods. That's a case of what the Greeks might have called arete, virtue. We wouldn't make this a legal question necessarily. If somebody's lost it, they've lost it. But the idea that you have a responsibility to return these goods, I think that's a value. Now the question is, who judges this? If nobody sees you, in our law, there's nothing we can do. Maybe it shows up on Facebook. Maybe there's surveillance cameras. But absent that, it's up to you. In this system, though, there is surveillance. It's cosmic surveillance. Someone is always watching, and he knows if you've been sleeping, and he knows if you're awake, and he knows if you've been bad or good. So be good. Because he's making a list and checking it twice. I also like in the last verse the compassion. Not just compassion for your fellow Israelite, but compassion for their animals. There's other passages that say even if your enemy's animal falls, you help them up. So there's a sense of compassion, even if it's not full personhood for animals, because they eat them and sacrifice them and do other things. Nevertheless, there's compassion for suffering. And then verse 5 seems to come out of nowhere. A woman must not put on man's apparel, nor shall a man wear women's clothing, for whoever does these things is abhorrent to your God. What does that have to do with helping the animal up? Seems to be out of nowhere, right? But if it's a concept of taboo and evil and virtue, now it operates on a spiritual plane. You violated a divine commandment that upsets the God, not just a human commandment that has a consequence for other people. This rule, by the way, is used in some communities to prohibit women from wearing a tallis, a prayer shawl, or wearing a kippah, a yarmulke, or putting on tefillin, because those are defined as men's clothing. That's why in some communities women are forced to wear long skirts. They are not allowed to wear pants, because that's men's clothing. This rule continues to be enforced in some of these communities, sometimes to their detriment. The whole question of who wears what and what makes women's clothing is still a hot topic, as we know even today. And when you're dealing with children, it gets even more ridiculous. What defines girls' clothing? My approach is whatever a girl wants to wear. I don't care what color it is. I don't care what part of the department store it's in. If it fits and she wants to wear it, or if it doesn't fit and she wants to wear it. It's girls' clothing, it's boys. Why label them? It doesn't make any sense. Just like the toys in the toy store. Do you need girls' toys and boys' toys, or you just have toys in categories? At some point, this gender binary that's rooted in this culture is something in some areas that we can certainly leave behind. In verse 6, another question, again, we might say, does this have to do with wearing clothing? No, but it's about this purity rule. If along the road you chance upon a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with fledglings or eggs, and the mother sitting over the fledglings or on the eggs, do not take the mother along with the young. Let the mother go, and take only the young, in order that you may fare well and have a long life. Is this practical wisdom? It's not nice to the mother. But it's practical because if you shoo off the mother bird and just take the eggs, what's the mother bird going to do? Eventually, she'll lay more eggs, and you'll get more. You can go back and do it again. So it's not nice to the mother, but it's practical. Now, this particular story shows up in rabbinic literature in a tragic way. A bunch of rabbis were walking in the afternoon at the end of Shabbat. They saw a man, before Shabbat was over, climb a tree and take the mother bird with the eggs and go away. After Shabbat had ended, they looked again and they saw another man who had waited for the end of Shabbat, who then climbed another tree, shooed away the mother bird, and took only the eggs. And on coming down the tree, he was bit by a snake and he died. And one of the rabbis who was there saw these two stories, these two incidents. And he said, what about the promise here? If you do this, if you let the mother go, it says that you will fare well and have a long life. And he got the opposite. The one who followed the rule died, and the one who broke the rule lived. And famously ascribed to him was the phrase, Leit din v'leit dayan. There is no justice and there is no judge. This was the heretic rabbi Elisha ben Avuya, who left rabbinic Judaism, became a heretic, maybe a hero to secular Jews later. But he was faced with the contradiction of the law and its promise of cosmic reward and the actual practice of life. That's one of the risks of that taboo cosmic approach. If it's violated, then maybe all is permitted. They have more practical advice. If you build a new house, you make a fence around the roof so somebody doesn't fall and kill themselves. They suggest not sowing a vineyard with two different kinds of seeds, not plowing with an ox and a donkey together. I mean, maybe those are practical wisdom. Maybe those are taboo, keep things separate. Do not wear a clothing with combining wool and linen together. This is a rule called shatnez, so no cotton blends, no mixing things. Again, it's the purity laws, not a practical law necessarily, although sometimes mixed garments don't wash well, so maybe there's a practical benefit too. Make tassels on 4 corners of the garment. This is the tzitzit, the fringes. And now we have another Me Too moment. A householder takes a woman as his wife and cohabits with her, and then he takes an aversion to her. And he makes up charges against her, defames her, saying, "This woman I took to wife, when I approached her, I found she was not a virgin." In such a case, the girl's father and mother shall produce the evidence of the girl's virginity before the elders of the town at the gate. Do you know what that is, the evidence? It's the bloody sheet from the marriage bed. Now we know in modern science that a hymen can break for a lot of reasons. Activity, walking, it's not, on automatic. But over the centuries, this proof of virginity, the bloody sheet, has been a matter of life or death for thousands and even millions of women. The girl's father, if they have this proof, shall say to the elders, "I gave my daughter to this man to wife. He's taken an aversion to her. He's made up charges. But here is the proof of my daughter's virginity. We did our job as parents. We kept her pure." And they spread out the cloth before the elders. Now, what does the daughter think of this? We don't know. The elders shall take that party, the one who complained about the woman, and they will flog him. They will fine him 100 shekels of silver and give it to the girl's father. Not to the girl, because she's his wife. They give it to the girl's father because his honor has been defamed by the accusation that his daughter was not a virgin. That householder has defamed a virgin in Israel, and she shall remain his wife. He will never have the right to divorce her. That'll show him. What does she think about this? She's not a full person, you see. She doesn't have a voice in these stories. But, it says, if the charge proves true, the girl was found not to have been a virgin, then she shall be brought to the entrance of her father's house, and the town council will stone her to death. For she did a shameful thing in Israel, committing fornication while under her father's authority. Thus you will sweep, same line as the child, right? Thus you will remove evil from your midst. You getting a flavor of this dynamic? The woman is partial, as property, as the vehicle for the family honor. Well, it gets even worse. We're going to jump over this passage, both for time and for content, because these next passages talk about what could be understood as rape, or simply as adultery. But in any case, it's often the woman who is blamed for this, especially the differentiation between what happens to a girl in a city and what happens to a girl in the country. Because the assumption is that if a girl and a man are caught together having lain together in the countryside, she is not blamed, because she could have cried out and nobody would have heard it. But if they are found in a city, she is blamed because she could have cried out and someone could have found her. That's the assumption. Now, we know that isn't how this works, but that was the assumption. And ultimately, if a man, the last one is the worst. If a man comes upon a virgin who is not engaged, and he seizes her and lies with her and they are discovered, the party who lay with her shall pay the girl's father 50 shekels, because again he violated the honor, and she shall become his wife. And because he violated her, he has never the right to divorce her. Again, I'm going to punish the man by making him stay married to the woman. And what the woman thinks doesn't matter. Full person, partial person. Now, we then shift gears. We talk about purity laws for the community of Yahweh, the kahal, the congregation of the Hebrew God. How to keep that pure. Do not let any man with crushed genitals into the space. That's treif. That's blech. No mamzer, no bastard, someone with questionable parentage is allowed in to this congregation. No Ammonite or Moabite is allowed into the congregation. And if you read the story of the background of the Ammonites and Moabites, they're the children of incest. When Lot and his daughters flee from Sodom and Gomorrah, they get him drunk and they sleep with him and they produce the Ammonites and the Moabites. So they've been bastards from the beginning. And we don't let them in at all. No conversion, no possibility. And so on for other peoples that are rejected. The Edomites are allowed in after 3 generations. So they have to try and they get rejected. And they try and they get rejected. And the grandkids, maybe those you'll allow in. Now it also gives you very practical rules. If you have a nocturnal emission when you're in military camp, go get cleaned up. There should be an area outside of a camp to relieve yourself. And you'll have a spike, you dig a hole, and you bury up your poop. So how nice of them to offer this practical wisdom. Now, this is framed in not a sanitary reason, as a purity reason, but we can see there's a practical benefit to this rule. This is based on experience. It's framed as a holy law, as a purity law, but it's based on practical experience. And then we get a wonderful law. You shall not turn over to the master a slave who seeks refuge with you from that master. Such individuals shall live with you in any place they may choose among the settlements in your midst, anywhere they want, and you will not ill-treat them. Compassion for the runaway slave. That's much better than this country did for the first half of its existence. Keep in mind, in the Constitution, there's a provision to return slaves to their masters, not just the Fugitive Slave Law of 1852. Now, how do you support this community of Yahweh? Do not bring the fee of a whore or the pay of a dog. No dirty money. Only clean money can come in. And while we're on the subject of clean money, do not deduct interest from loans to your fellow Israelites. You may deduct interest from loans to foreigners. This is the origin of the Jewish moneylender idea, because Jews could lend at interest to others, but not within their own community. But there is a sense of compassion there. We see with student loan debt, we see with credit card debt, mortgage debt, medical debt, how debt is crushing, and how not lending at interest is a sign of compassion. In fact, there's even organizations called the Hebrew Free Loan Societies that give loans to Jews to help them start businesses and move forward, and the free loan means no interest, so you can get started. Here we have another rule of men and women together, but this one is progress for its time in chapter 24. A man takes a woman into his household as wife, becomes her husband. She fails to please him for some reason. He writes her a Sefer Kritut, a book of cutting off, a bill of divorce. In modern Jewish life, a get, right? And she is freed. He hands it to her, he sends her away from his house. She leaves his household, becomes the wife of another man, and the latter man rejects her, writes her a bill of divorce, so she's 0 for 2, hands it to her and sends her away, or the man dies who took her to wife. Then the first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again. No takebacks. Right? You don't get to remarry the woman you divorced once because she has been defiled. Oh, it's not about psychological wisdom. Or maybe it is. But it's framed in the language of purity, taboo, and what's allowed. When a man has newly taken a woman into his household, he will not go out with the army or be assigned to it. He will be exempt 1 year for the sake of his household, to give happiness to the woman he has taken, to rejoice with her. Now, is this compassion for the woman? Yes. The idea that women are, in fact, encouraged to have pleasure in marital relations is part of Jewish tradition.
Maybe it's also to have children.
Maybe it's also to have children, because if you're away the first year you've just got married, guess what might happen in the meantime? While you're away at the army, you know, the mice might play. So again, there's always two sides to this: the positive interpretation, which is part of Jewish tradition, but also the practical side of how to preserve paternity. And here we have more economic legislation, but what's fascinating is, as insulting and problematic as the personal status legislation is, the economic stuff is great. A hand mill or an upper millstone will not be taken in pawn. That would be taking someone's life in pawn. You're taking away their means of making a living. It's like debtor's prison in England, right? How are they supposed to earn money if you take away their millstone? That's their life you're taking. When you make a loan of any sort to your compatriot, do not enter his house to seize the pledge, his collateral. Let him hold on to the collateral. You don't have to humiliate him by taking it away. You must remain outside while the party to whom you made the loan brings the pledge, the collateral out to you. If the party is needy, do not go to sleep in that pledge. You return the pledge at sundown. If they have traded it, you've settled things up because they need it so that the owner can sleep. If he's lent you his blanket as collateral, give him back the blanket. Have compassion, and it will be mirrored to you because God's keeping score. That's the framing, the reason why. But we would say it's for compassion for the person. Do not abuse a needy and destitute laborer, whether a fellow Israelite or a stranger. Both of them treat equally, and pay out the wages you owe them on the same day, before the sun sets, because the worker is needy and depends on it. God will count you guilty if you don't. Today we call it wage theft. Today we call it withholding payment, mandatory overtime. We have an enforcement mechanism that isn't God counting guilty. But we still support the value of paying the worker what they're due when they're owed it. I love that my tradition had this rule 2,500 years ago. This is positive. This is wonderful. Parents should not be put to death for children, nor children for parents, each for their own sins. More compassion. Do not subvert the rights of the stranger or the fatherless. Do not take a widow's garment in pawn. Don't leave her naked. Let her have dignity. Remember, you were a slave in Egypt. Your God saved you from there, and therefore I command you to fulfill this. Care for the weak, because you were weak. When you reap the harvest of your fields, and you overlook a sheaf of wheat, don't go back and get it. When you beat down the fruit of your olive trees, don't go over them again. When you gather the grapes of your vineyards, don't pick them over again. Those go to the stranger, to the fatherless, and to the widow, to the weak, the ones that don't own property, that can't support themselves. Marvelous. Compassion. Do you need a God to be compassionate? We would say no. This text puts it in that God's mouth, and the God is the enforcement mechanism. Always remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and therefore I enjoin upon you this commandment. Well, I could go on. Chapter 25 goes into levirate marriage, which is a fascinating topic. It also warns women not to intervene when fighting by grabbing the genitals of the man your husband is fighting with, and because you might lose your hand for that. Have fair weights and measures, and always blot out the memory of the nation of Amalek who attacked you, and never forget to blot out the memory of the nation of Amalek who attacked you, which you can't do both of. There's so much more. This is one of the richest Torah portions for discussions, and we've just skimmed the surface. But I hope you've seen through this process this challenging issue of how to enforce laws, why to be good, and whether the letter of the law is enough. Sometimes that virtue, that caring for dignity, that compassion is even more than what the letter of the law can prescribe. And if we want to be good people, it's not just hitting the minimum standards. It's going above and beyond.